Well, I'm Tom McGehee, the Museum Director for Bellingrath Gardens, and our topic today is looking at the Bellingraths trip of 1934. Now, the trip that the Bellingraths took covered Alabama, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Colorado, Utah. They got to Yellowstone, Montana, Glacier National Park, Calgary, Canada, Banff, Lake Louise, and finally 1 month after they left, they decided to go to Alaska. So this is all done thanks to a diary that we'll be talking about. But I want to talk about who was on the trip. Roughly. So there is the vehicle they drove in. That is a 1934 Cadillac with 16 cylinders. And according to the driver, it got 9 miles to the gallon. So again, when you look at how far they drove, all the way to Canada, then after what we're going to talk about, they went to California, down across the west, went into Tijuana, Mexico. I mean, they covered some ground in this vehicle. And every inch of that road was driven by Mrs. Bellingrath's nephew. So in this group, there's Ernest Edgar kneeling at the wheel of the car. He's 28 years old. He is the son of Daisy Edgar, who is Mrs. Bellingrath's sister, and his wife is with him. She's got the hat on, standing over there on the other side of Mrs. Burnett. Mrs. Bellingrath and Mr. Bellingrath at the back, and she's got that pocketbook clasped, full of checks, you know, made pay with cash. She was always ready to buy something. And then kneeling over on the left-hand side is Mrs. Bellingrath's niece, and that is Mildred Dorgan. And her mother is Pearl Morse Dorgan. Now, one of the nieces said the Morse family apparently named their daughters after cows, because you got Pearl, Bessie, and she was joking, saying all the names sound like they're named after cows, but they're just old-fashioned names. And Pearl was married to Will Dorgan, who at this point is the vice president and sales manager at the Coca-Cola Bottling Company. Ernest Edgar is a bookkeeper, the driver. So there's 6 of them in this car, and what did make it in the diary was Ernest said each one was told of the passengers what size suitcase they could bring. Because you notice there's no roof rack, and there's 6 of them in there. So they literally had to put the bags on the floor. And here each of the passengers had a size bag they could fit down there. And what did the Bellingraths bring? It's not visible. It's a steamer trunk mounted on the back of this car. And Ernest said that was one of the reasons this car had so many blowouts, because all the weight of that and 6 people, it made it a heavier car. So he had to fix 16 blowouts on this trip. So here's the author of our diary. This is Ernest's wife. They'd been married less than 2 years at this point, and her name was Amelia Moore, and they were married in 1932. And here's from the diary, and you can see she's writing about her experience, and she says here, almost a miracle happened to us today. Ernest came home from the office for lunch and asked me if I would like to, quote, go west. Would I? Does a cat like milk or cream? Of course, I thought that he was only joking, but he was serious. His aunt and uncle have asked us to take a western trip with them to be gone about 3 months. Just think of it, California, Canada, Alaska. Am I thrilled? It is so sudden, and we've only 10 days to get ready in, but I could be ready to travel tomorrow if it were necessary. Now to get busy. So it's intriguing when I read this diary, she's really talking about her own personal experience with this. And yet, we'll see later on, she has it typed up and gives it to Mrs. Bellingrath for Christmas, or to Mr. and Miss Bellingrath. But I hoped that there'd be more interaction with the Bellingraths. There's a little bit, but it's really more about what all they see, and that gets kind of interesting. Because, as I mentioned, they had gone, and this was kind of typical of the Bellingraths, they started from here, they go to Montgomery. They have to go visit his brother there. Then they have to go to Selma and visit his sister. Then they leave Selma and then they go to Little Rock to visit his brother. Then they have to go to Pine Bluff to visit another brother. Like all that. And once they get out of seeing all the Bellingrath family members that they need to visit, that's when they start upward. So they leave on June 16th, and exactly 1 month later, on July 16th, Amelia writes that Aunt Bessie announced while they're in Vancouver that we're going to Alaska and to Canada. I also thought it was interesting that in some of the notes, July 12th, while they were in Lake Louise in Canada, she wrote, "They write us from home that it is 98, and here we are seeing snow and wearing winter coats. It snowed here today." So here we are with 98 degrees out here in June, but they were having a heat wave in Mobile even in 1934. So she mentions about getting gasoline, and by the way, the car, as I mentioned, got 9 miles to the gallon, and in 1934, the average price of gasoline was 19 cents a gallon. And she mentions that they went through automobile tunnels, which she thought was so neat. Of course, this is, 5 years before the Bankhead Tunnel is open, so we don't have an automobile tunnel in Mobile, so she's very interested in that. So they get to Vancouver, and they stay at the Georgia Hotel. This hotel was built in 1927. It's still there. It has hosted everyone from the Prince of Wales to Errol Flynn to the Beatles. And this is where Mrs. Bellingrath was telling them they decided to go on up into Alaska. So they leave Seattle. They had to rush. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon. They had to make a 7 o'clock sailing. And they get there. And I'm sorry, there's a good map of Alaska. And they're really over on the right-hand side, of course, down low in Seattle. So they're making, or Vancouver, so they're making their way up towards Alaska. And here is the ship they board, the SS Haleakala, which she mentions is a former Hawaiian vessel, and this postcard I've got mentions it's in Hawaii. So this ship has been, seems kind of strange that a ship that was created to ply the water around Hawaii or suddenly up on the west coast that far north. And she writes, stateroom so small, quote, you almost have to back out of it to turn around, but we love it. And she mentions that she's so glad she is not getting seasick. And then the next day she says, this air is clear and cold and it really makes you hungry. We came to Queen Charlotte Sound and I lost everything I'd eaten for a week, but then I felt a little bit better and went to sleep. Wednesday, gloomy, misty, and cold, wrapped up in blankets and sat on the deck. I mean, you think about these cruise ships that people are on now that have all these amenities and all these things going on, that was not the way it was in 1934. They dock at Ketchikan, Alaska, and they get off and walk around, and they get back on the boat and go to Sitka. And Sitka is one of the oldest cities in Alaska, and it was really founded by the Russians. In fact, one of my tour guides just came back from a trip to Alaska, and she recognized this picture immediately. Said, we went and visited that church. And I said, no, you didn't. She said, oh, yes, I did. I said, no, you didn't, because this burned down in 1966. It's been rebuilt. So the church that they toured dated from 1842. So it's almost 100 years old in 1934. And what's key, she writes, and they charge us 50 cents to visit it. Now, 50 cents was a lot of money then in 1934. Then they took a taxi to what she called Lover's Lane, or Totem Pole Lane. Ethel said she saw this too on her trip, which is still there. And she was interested in the totem poles. She said all are carved out of a single trunk. And we visited a museum where we learned there are 3 types of totem poles: legendary, household, and death. Legendary tells the tale of a hero. Household tells the tribe and family belonged to, and death is used to mark the spot as someone deceased, or it may have been hollowed out and contains the deceased. It's interesting, in some of our old pictures, we had a totem pole here at Bellingrath Gardens in the 30s, and it was a gift from William Bellingrath to the Bellingraths. So that's Miss Bellingrath's brother in Montgomery had been to Alaska, bought a totem pole and brought it down here and put it in the gardens. I'm afraid the termites probably got it a long time ago. So they go back to the ship and go back to Skagway. And they board a train, and you can still board these trains up there. And she describes it as a little old train pulled by 3 engines. They go up to Old White Pass, had lunch at Lake Bennett, and had quote-unquote moose pie. And I don't think that's chocolate mousse. I think they really mean they're eating moose. It was certainly different. Maybe that's why we enjoyed our meal so much. And then she comments, there was the best looking, she mentioned it several times in here, she's going, there was the best looking Royal Mounted policeman here, all dressed up in his scarlet coat, trained with another 26 miles. Then they get to Whitehorse, and here is a postcard, and that's Walter Bellingrath's handwriting up there. So it mentions we were here July 20th and 21st, and that's exactly the date in the diary where they were here. So that's a view of the town of Whitehorse. She mentions here, in Whitehorse they served us moose steaks, caribou, and some kind of bird they have up here. They were quite good, but give me a good old beef steak any day for a steady diet. Then they boarded this boat, which is now a tourist attraction called the Klondike. This is really like a riverboat that would have been plying the waters of the Alabama River back in the 19th century between Mobile and points north. And she mentions there are only 20 people on the boat, so we can go almost anywhere we want. They are certainly good to you. And here from that postcard from Mr. Bellingrath, he's mentioning that they're on the boat. It's typed over the name of what the ship was. It says the SS Klondike, and then it has all the different things that are offered for the meal that night. And the next stop is Dawson, and Dawson was kind of the center of the 1897-1899 gold rush that hit Alaska. And she also mentions on the boat, I should have mentioned this before, which is intriguing, we had to stop twice for wood today. And it is interesting how fast the men can load 12 cords of wood. This is exactly what the riverboats on the Alabama River were doing. They could not carry enough wood to make the entire trip. They had to stop at wood yards along the route and pick up wood. So this is the same kind of thing going up in Alaska because they can't carry enough wood to run this boat. So they're still throwing timber into the furnace here to get this boat running. It's not on, you'd think it'd be on diesel by this point, but it was not. And there's his writing. And by the way, it says, we were here July 23rd and 22nd. Dawson was the headquarters of the Klondike Gold Stampede in 1898. By the way, this postcard, I came across, it's kind of a paper thing, opens up with these images, and I found it in an antique shop. And it was in a brown envelope with a lot of other postcards addressed to George B. Rogers of Antwerp Building, Mobile, Alabama. George Rogers, of course, is the architect of the gardens. So this is 1934. He's been working with them for several years now, since 1927, and he's writing George Rogers, telling about their trip and all the things they've experienced. Now, one of the sites in this little town of Dawson, and by the way, she writes, I meant to tell you this, I couldn't find a picture of the hotel they were in. It's called the Royal Alexander Hotel. She mentions that this town, that the rooms were lined with tin, molded into different designs and painted. The bathroom was down at the end of the hall. If you wanted to take a bath, it was 50 cents extra. The streets here are unpaved and sidewalks are planks. I mean, this really is like going back into the old Wild West days. The town is built on a glacier. Many of the old abandoned buildings are leaning as a result. Took a tour, walked to a mine carrying candles, and walked about 30 feet over ice with walls of ice. Sounds nice on a day like this. Went back to Dawson and walked around and saw Service's cabin. So if you read that diary, you're like, what is Service's cabin? But lo and behold, there it is in that postcard view. Now, Mr. Bellingrath hasn't written any comment about this, but here's this little tiny little log cabin. And so I looked up, what is Service? Who is Service? Turns out it was a man named Robert W. Service. He was a British-Canadian poet and writer. He was known as the Bard of the Yukon. And he had come from a British family, but immigrated to the United States and then to Canada, and was working for a bank as a bank clerk, and they were moving him around, and he got up the Yukon and fell in love with it and started writing poems and stories about it. Now, his poetry was kind of poo-pooed by the experts at the time. It's not very good, but it sold. In fact, he did so well that in the end he was living between Paris and the French Riviera. So apparently, while he lived here, he got some inspiration to write some books and things, did very, very well. And by the 1930s, it's a tourist attraction. And oh, and there's Mr. Service right there. There's Robert Service. Kind of looks like a silent movie star. And there it is in more recent times. So it's still there, and it's still a tourist attraction. So here's the front of that letter. And he said, "Dear George, here we are 1,500 miles from north of Vancouver, BC, about 4,000 miles from Mobile. Believe it or not, it was 92 in the shade, and the mosquitoes were bad the days we were in Dawson. With best wishes, W.D. Bellingrath." So not everything went as smooth as possible. In fact, I got a note my cousin who was up there and said the mosquitoes were so bad on her trip that they were eating through the material of your shirts. I don't think I'll take the Mobile mosquitoes over that. So there it is, and a 2-cent stamp from Canada. Then their next stop, oh, and then, there you go. And, oh, well, I jumped ahead. There we go. The next stop was a little place called Stewart, and this is Stewart, a beautiful location. And while they're there, it said they stopped as they loaded silver ore aboard the Klondike. So they're watching as they're putting silver ore onto the Klondike. And it says, "It's funny," she writes, "they anchor barges piled high with silver ore and just leave them without a guard. Ernest asked one of the men if they were not afraid of it being stolen. The men looked at Ernest as if he had lost his mind and said, 'Well, it's against the law to steal in Canada.'" And she pauses and says, "Well, it's against the law to steal in the United States, but it's done all the time." Well, that was cute. This innocent Canadian, why, it's illegal to steal. And then Ernest had, it was interesting to me, Ernest had a long talk with a mounted. And that man could almost tell Ernest our whole life story. He knew our names, where we were going, business, and everything else. He said they keep a record of everyone who comes into the territory, and they keep track of everyone until they leave it. Apparently they had very good records. And here again is Mr. Bellingrath's handwriting at the top. "We saw some of these crossing the river. Here, and she writes, here at Stewart, we saw our first caribou swimming the river. When a herd crosses in front of the boat has to stop, for the caribou have the right of way." And she writes, "Nothing much to do aboard. We play card tricks and watch the scenery. Chief engineer is making me a pair of earrings out of mastodon's tusks." Now, where he found a mastodon, I don't know. "I watched for a while. It was interesting. One of the men on board asked Ernest if we were on our honeymoon. And here we have been married almost 2 years. Our bridge game was interrupted tonight when we came to some rapids, and the boat had to be pulled through them by means of an endless cable. We saw some more caribou, and one swam by the boat, and Ernest took his picture. The next day, they're still on the boat, and they go through what she's calling the Five Fingers Rapids. So the boat has to get through here. So while they do not look dangerous at first, they really are. The boat must be pulled through their center by a cable to avoid scraping the rocks on the sides. So that was not a small boat they're on, so to get through, they must have been interesting. And they stopped at this beautiful site. This is called Tantalus Butte, and hiked up and down a trip of land. I think he found a picture of what's left of the coal mine they visited, and went a little ways in. It was certainly cool and pleasant, but quite dirty. Well, back on the boat, I get back on the boat, and the chief engineer takes them up to the pilot house and says we had a first-hand glimpse of how the boat was run. Friday on the Klondike, on the last night, and they arrive in Whitehorse and get back on the train back to Skagway. And it stops at a place called Inspiration Point, and she describes, here's a picture, she writes, "Here's a monument to the horses who died that winter of the gold rush. We do not," and this is what that plaque says, "The dead are speaking in memory of us 3,000 pack animals that died, that laid our bones on these awful hills during the gold rush of 1897 and 98. And there are photographs online showing the skeletons going on for a mile, looks like, of all these animals that were just left out to freeze to death. It says, the 3,000 pack animals that laid our bones on these awful hills during the gold rush. We now thank those listening that heard our groans across the years. We waited, but not in vain. So that's kind of an interesting poem on here with the pack animals you can see walking. So then they get back to Whitehorse and then to Skagway, and they arrive at the Pullen House. And here is a picture of where they were staying. The Pullen House, and a card there, it mentions that rooms are $1 a night and up, and meals are $1. And the lady staying there is Mrs. Pullen, who arrived during the Great Gold Rush. She describes the house as into the rooms. She says, the pictures and furnishings of the rooms are relics of those old days. It's a place you would not want to miss. She said one of her sons was the first boy from Alaska to enter West Point, and he received all his honors a cadet could receive. And then she describes their room. Well, our room actually had a bathtub in it. But if instead of it being in a separate room, it was out in the corner with a screen around it. It did its work, though. After supper, we went to the only show in town and were quite surprised to find a modern little movie theater. We watched the film from great big easy chairs. This sounds extremely modern, have big easy chairs in the movie theater. That's what they're doing now. And then the film was Melody Cruise, a musical comedy with Charlie Ruggles, and this was about a cruise ship that went from New York to California. So I think they're spun in this rustic place, sitting here watching, typical Hollywood of 1934 and their white tie and tails dancing around these ships. That was not exactly what the ship was like they were on. Well, the next morning is Sunday, and after breakfast, Mrs. Pullen, here she is in some Indian garb, told of her early experiences in Alaska, how she had been a widow and arrived there with just $7 in her purse, and got a job as a cook for $3 a day, which wasn't bad money back in the 1890s, and cooked out of a tent. After 3 months, she could afford to build a small cabin and sent for her 3 sons, and then built that hotel with a restaurant in it, and did very well. After lunch, we took what she quotes, the streetcar, which is really a bus, but everyone here calls it by the other name, and we saw the town. The driver, an old-timer, knows the history of every stick and stone. We heard all about the famous con man, Soapy Smith, and saw his grave. Soapy Smith's real name sounded a little nicer. It was Jefferson Randolph Smith II, and he was an American con artist and gangster who got his start in Colorado and ended up moving up to Alaska. And the reason he got his nickname of Soapy is one of his stunts was he would stand on street corners and have paper wrapped bars of soap and explain there was a cash prize in many of them. And he'd offer them for sale, and he'd have his men stationed in the crowd, and one said, I'll take one, I'll give you $1. And he'd tear it up and say, oh, I got a $5 bill in here. And he'd get them all worked up, and he said, well, there's a $100 bill still to be found, and they'd be auctioning off these bars of soap, and he'd be pulling in 10s and 20s, when that was a heck of a lot of money. And then, of course, the only people getting the soap with the money in it were his cohorts. Well, apparently, they got tired of it, and he got shot up there, and that was the end of Soapy. He got shot on the wharf up there, and she mentions here, we went and visited his grave, and there it is. It's still a tourist attraction. So and then she said that we walked to a flower garden, but I really didn't expect to see much in Alaska. And did I ever get fooled? So here's a picture of a flower garden I found in that town. She was at that point, the dahlias, I've never seen such flowers anywhere else in all my life. The dahlias measured 11 and 12 inches across. I put the ruler to them myself. They were wonderful. Well, all good things come to an end. So at the Pullen House, that's all that's left of that hotel. That's one of the things that didn't last, but the chimney's still there. Well, at the last minute, we found out that we'd get passage on the SS Alaska. So after hurriedly packing, we got aboard. So here we are, heading towards the good old USA, a much nicer boat than the one we came up on. So apparently she wasn't too excited about that little wood-fired steamer. They arrived in Juneau about 8 a.m. the next morning. They saw the capital and shop, but they were only there an hour. The boat stopped at funny little canning ports. including one called Hoona, and here is an image of Hoona, Alaska. And so she stopped and walked to an Indian village a country mile away. Oh, forgot to say, we saw whale spout this afternoon. Wish the boat could have been closer to them. Well, she writes the next day, there's nothing very exciting going on. Some more fish, in cans, of course. So this boat, the SS Alaska, is taking passengers, but it's also picking up cans of fish, because canning was one of the biggest exports from Alaska, which of course was not a state at that point, and they are canning salmon and shipping it. I can't think of any more canned salmon, but apparently that was a big thing. Because here she mentions they're in cans, of course. The cargo this trip is 48,000 crates with 48 cans to the crate. We are quite fishy. It is almost interesting to see them load this salmon. We usually get off the boat and inspect the things being sold by native women. In the winter, people do not live at the canneries, but in some town or city. The children are fat and dirty, but just as cute as they can be. They are timid and will hide behind their mother's skirt when you speak to them. The natives are very polite and appreciate anything that you buy from them. Then they go to Sitka again. Saw the ice storage house where they freeze the fish and keep them indefinitely. Pleasant thought. These fish are as stiff as a board, and when dropped sound like blocks of wood falling. There are countless stacks on stacks all the way to the ceiling. There are all kinds, herring, salmons, halibut, and many others. Remember 1934, there were no deep freezes. You could have a section for some ice in an ice box maybe, but they didn't have deep freezes. I think it was very novel for them to go in a place where all this ice fish and frozen things were. It was listed before Mr. Birdseye came along. So she was very interested in that. Thursday, August 2nd, Wrangell next. There were some lovely shops. And there's a view of it. Quote, do I love to look even if I can't buy? Really enjoyed our stop here. 10:30 at night. Again, 10:30 at night. We stopped at Ketchikan. The time is night, but in spite of the lateness, everyone got off and the shops were all open. This was our final stop in Alaska, and I hated to say goodbye to what she called Uncle Sam's attic. We walked around and found a little drugstore where they actually sold bottled Coca-Cola. It was 15 cents a bottle. Remember, Coca-Colas in Mobile were 5 cents a bottle until 1955. And what happened in 1955? Mr. Bellingrath died and they jumped the price. Every place else had jumped the price, I think, to 7 cents. And Mr. Bellingrath went to his grave saying Coca-Cola should never cost more than 5 cents. So they are shocked that up here is 3 times that price, 15 cents for a bottle. But she said, but I didn't mind for that, for I was anxious to taste it, the first Coca-Cola in weeks. Well, we saw loads of fish brought in by boats by sundown. I have never seen so many at one time. Poor little fishes, they will all be in tin cans before another night comes. Some of the passengers complained about the boat stopping at every little cannery, but it was really interesting, and we got an inside look into the lives of those native fishermen. And besides, it made our trip several days longer. I hate to think that our Alaskan trip is just about over. Friday, August 3rd, costume party on board. We had a good time watching them. Then we had some music and danced a while, and during intermission played a couple of hands of bridge, but I stopped in plenty of time to get to bed before the boat reaches Queen Charlotte Sound. August 4th, Saturday, captain's dinner, lovely menus, and paper caps. Each state had to march around when the name was called, their state was called. However, we marched twice, one for Dixie and the other because we were Alabama bound. Arrived in Seattle. The shoreline was lovely. That's an impressive shoreline. It really was a sight to remember. We went to the Olympic Hotel for the night, and did we ever have the mail waiting for us. This hotel, by the way, dates to 1924. It's still there. It's now a Fairmont, and the best prices this week are between $299 and $342 a night. I don't know what Bellingraths paid, but I promise you it wasn't that much money. Then she writes, I'm sorry that our Alaskan trip is all over, for we met some lovely people, and I wonder if we will ever see them again. Maybe so, maybe not. Fate is a funny thing, and the most unexpected can always happen. Now this is just a week or so of this trip that literally took from June through late September. And this diary ends a little bit earlier in September because Mrs. Edgar has to take the niece, who's 13 years old, back to Mobile so she can go back to school, because school's starting in the middle of the month. So there's actually another couple of weeks. We do not have much documentation what happened because there was nobody there writing about it. But that's when they go to Tijuana and Mexico and kind of do the southern route coming back to Mobile. And they get to, so it'd be Mrs. Bellingrath, Mr. Bellingrath, Mamie Bellingrath Burnett, and Ernest. And he said they got as far as Biloxi, and he had the 16th blowout. And he said he remembered, and he's 28 years old, remember this big old car, and pulls over and just kind of hangs his head. And Mrs. Bellingrath piped up and said, "Bell, this is one flat tire. Ernest is not changing." And Mr. Bellingrath looked at her and said, "Well, who do you think is going to change it?" She said, "That man back there at that filling station. Ernest, go tell that man." And he said, "That kid was so young, he'd never seen a car like that and had no idea what to do. So I changed that one too." And another time, he told me that they had a flat tire and that they were, you remember the roads were pretty bad back then, but you can imagine that the apron wasn't too good to be putting a car on a jack. So he had that Cadillac kind of over the asphalt and had it jacked up. And at that point he was under it doing something. And Amelia said, "Ernest, we're going to have to move the car." And because he meant hot, dirty, and under that car, but "Damn it, I'm not moving this car." And all of a sudden he said he looked over and saw two very shiny black boots and realized it was a state trooper. And he kind of came out and looked kind of sheepish. And the state trooper looked over the situation. He said, "That's all right, stay here. I'll watch the car. I'll make sure no one bothers you." So you got to change it. I love it. This idea. Mrs. Bellingrath and Biloxi saying, "He's not changing this one." Well, so the diary is typed up, and they give it to Mr. and Mrs. Bellingrath from Amelia and Ernest, Christmas 1935. And I was very lucky to have a family member give this to me. Actually, it was a niece gave this to me, a copy, so we have her archives. The original one was Mrs. Bellingrath kept it in her bedroom. And when Mr. Bellingrath died in 1955, his secretary went into the bedroom and took it and gave it to the niece and said, "I'm afraid they'll throw this away." So we're lucky to have that. What we don't have, unfortunately, according to the newspaper, Mobile Register, in September 30th of 1934, they interviewed Mr. Bellingrath, and he talked all about all the things he saw on his trip, and he mentions, and you know, Bellingrath Gardens is, he said, a lot of people we ran into know more about Bellingrath Gardens out west than they do right here in their own town. And you know, he was always upset when he found people who had never been to Bellingrath Gardens and they were right from Mobile. So part of the reporter's last thing was, not only did they have wonderful memories, but Mr. Bellingrath tells us that he had produced 3,000 feet of film, of movie film, of the adventure. Now, I don't know whatever happened to all that movie film, but it'd be incredible to see those films and actually see them walk around all these places I'm talking about. Well, that's just like I said, a small part of that trip. We'll have many other opportunities to look at further parts of that diary and some of the other things they saw, the tour of the great parks and hotels. And by the way, I should say the other thing, you can see these grand hotels the Bellingraths were staying in. Ernest told me that when they would arrive in a town and they found the hotel, Mr. Bellingrath made him park the vehicle around the corner. And Ernest had to haul all their luggage into the hotel because Mr. Bellingrath was afraid the bellboys would rush the car and they'd all want a tip. Now that tells you in a nutshell how cheap he was. So Ernest said, I'd have to drag all that luggage, you know, all by himself because he was the only other male there. Mr. Bellingrath wasn't going to do it. You know, he was 75 years old and he was enjoying his position. So Ernest did it all, but they all had a really good time on this trip. So I'll end it there. If you have any questions, please let me know. Yes?
How many gallons did that carry?
That I don't remember, but I know he said that he didn't trust the gauge, and he kept a stick that he could stick down in the tank and measure it to make sure it had enough gasoline. And he also said somewhere out west, and I think Anthony Ernest is 28 years old and maps it all out where they're going, and he was at some point, he didn't remember where they were, and there was, just like movies, like one of those wooden signs with arrows pointing, you know, where to go. And Ernest got out and was looking at his map, and Mr. Bellingrath got out and said, well, it says we go this way. And Ernest said, that's not what the map says. And sure enough, someone had turned that sign. And if they had followed that, they would have been in the middle of nowhere near gasoline stations or anything else. So Ernest remembered that very distinctly about that. And the other funny story I want to tell you real quick, Mamie Burnett was Mr. Bellingrath's sister, and she and her husband had the Coca-Cola bottling company up in Andalusia. And she was sitting apparently in the back seat in the middle and had this big hat on. And Ernest remembered trying to back that Cadillac. I mean, if you ever look at these old cars from the 30s, they didn't have big windows in the back. They were like little small windows. So he's trying to maneuver that huge car going backwards, and he's thinking to himself, if she would just take that stupid hat off, I could see, and all of a sudden, boom, they hit a telephone pole. And he said he got out, and she said, oh no, because this is a brand new Cadillac. And he gets out, looks at the dent on the bumper, and Mr. Bellingrath gets out, and he said, boy, I'm going to get it now. And Mr. Bellingrath looked at it and said, that's all right, Ernest. If Mamie wasn't wearing that stupid hat, you'd have been able to see her. That's funny. Mr. Bellingrath was thinking the same thing he was thinking. Did you have a question?
Do they carry gas with them?
I'm sorry?
Do they carry gas with them?
Not that Ernest ever mentioned. I don't know where they would have put it in the car, to tell you the truth. But apparently he had it mapped out. And remember, there were no interstates at this point, so they really had to, in the automobile traffic by the 20s was picked up for promoting this idea of traveling across the country. So this is a decade later, but they still, they're not chain gasoline stations everywhere or chain restaurants or fast food or anything else. So they mentioned in the death section, if you have hot and dry, they are hoping to get someplace to stop and get something to drink. So, and the dust, they talk about the dust in some of these places that, oh, we were so glad, and she calls it oiled pavement. She said, we were so glad to get on the oiled pavement, and I think she means asphalt, and the dust stopped. Because you imagine the windows are open, it's hot, there's no air conditioning, this dust is flying all around, so it wasn't all real luxurious to ride around in a Cadillac in 1934.
Is this dirt oiled up?
So what?
It's dirt that's oiled.
Oil like asphalt?
No, it's
They
sprayed
do?
on.
Oh, sprayed onto the
Yeah,
dirt.
it's
Oh,
oiled
okay.
forward, yeah.
So that's even before real asphalt then. I guess it worked better than water, which would evaporate. Yeah.